коник у вороненький, скачи та гуляй. Гості, гості, мій паначе, моя дівчина плаче, на кого ж ти покидаєш, тільки подумай. Лучше було мене води, лучше було не люби, лучше було дай не знать, чим тепер забувати.
Historically, Cossacks were a group of predominantly Orthodox Christian, Eastern Slavic-speaking warriors. They became known as members of democratic, self-governing, semi-military communities on the steppe borderlands. And probably the most famed period in their history is 16th-17th century, when formally being subjects of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth they implemented rather independent policy, being a serious military power in the region, and eventually raised a rebellion against the Polish Szlachta that took place in the 17th century, which basically is a little later period than the real-life 15th-16th centuries that seem to be the main inspiration for Dark Souls 3. Of course, it's a really approximate estimation, and there are things in Dark Souls 3 that are way older than real-life 15th century, but really lots of things are inspired by 15th, 16th century stuff, but no later than that. However, although iconic image of Cossacks is that of 17th century Cossacks, when, for example, firearms had a way more extensive use, naturally affecting the military art and gear. Dark Souls 3 in fact provides some rather good options for Cossack cosplay that I'd like to show you in this video. Traditionally, let's start with Slider's screen, though as it's not a cosplay of a specific historical figure, but rather Cossacks in general, there isn't much to talk about there. Pretty much the only strict requirement for appearance is about haircut and mustache. So, as for hair, in Dark Souls 3 there are no Cossack mohawk haircuts, called chaprina, but the bald or closely shaven haircuts present in Dark Souls 3 work rather well in overall appearance. And basically a lone lock of hair wouldn't be really that noticeable in Dark Souls combat anyway. As for mustaches, long, thick ones with no beards were super common. I also use some serious looking brows to complete the image. However, there is also another option, if you'd like your character to look younger but still historically Cossack-like. Namely, this bobbed haircut. With it we can use a thinner moustache for a younger look. Such haircut also fits historically. It could be also seen among Cossacks, yet I guess it was somewhat less common. Basically, I think it's also associated with more educated type of characters, rather than warriors, as I guess such haircuts were spread among seminarists of religious collegiums, academies. So, if you're making a cleric or sorcerer character you can use this haircut to have a Cossack cleric, sorcerer character. Well, I guess that's pretty much everything about the Slider's screen. I will also include the complete slider settings for my Cossack character in the end of the video in case anyone would be interested in it, but that's really just a random face. One of many options. Let's now move on and discuss armor, weapons and other equipment options. As for the armor, the most important part of this build are the brigand trousers. These trousers are really similar to those traditionally worn by Cossacks. And it's, in fact, not a coincidence. Though, the relation between the Dark Souls brigand trousers and Cossack attire isn't a direct one, it only makes it more interesting to discuss. So, the trousers worn by Cossacks are called sharovary, free to hips, often with assembly at the waist, collected at the bottom near the ankles. Being popular among the Cossacks, they became a part of the Ukrainian national costume. However, these pants in fact originate from an eastern land far away from Ukraine and were only brought to the territory of Ukraine by Turkic people. Basically, such trousers are spread among many of the eastern nations as a part of their national dress. For example, Turks, Kurds, but the Ukrainian name of these pants, sharovary, originates from their Persian name sholva, as well as the pants themselves originate from Iran, Afghanistan region. For example, again, the similar trousers were worn by Pashtun warriors of Afghanistan. And now, let's return to the brigand trousers of Dark Souls and recall what do we know about them within the game world. Basically, brigand trousers appeared as a part of the brigand set back in Dark Souls 1, and there it was told that they were worn by brigands who raided mountain hamlets and attacked travelers in the mountains. So, they were pretty much associated with mountain people. And taking in account their similarity to the real-life sholva trousers worn in Afghanistan mountains, I guess it's likely that exactly the people inhabiting the mountain regions of Iran, Afghanistan were the inspiration for Dark Souls mountain people, and their national wear sholva was inspiration for brigand set trousers. And since trousers traditionally worn by Cossacks are pretty much the same sholva, we can safely use the brigand trousers for the Cossack cosplay. Well, I devoted a lot of time to discuss this piece of armor, but it's really rather important since these trousers are one of the core elements of the cosplay, along with the sabre and a bold haircut, as they're indeed a part of an iconic Cossack image. Now, let's discuss the hand armor. Basically there's a rather wide choice here, and I'll explain why. But first, I'll say that, as Cossacks were at least partially an army of poor people, runaway serfs, peasants, the basic option I use is either nothing or master's gloves. However, even though fighting with no hand armor was rather common, of course it wasn't like there was no hand armor at all. Naturally there were some gloves, gauntlets, even if we take only the trophy stuff taken from polished cavalry, for example, and things like that. And not really everyone was a peasant treble, there were professional warriors, so-called registered Cossacks, who got paid for their service and supplied, after all. So in fact there's quite a wide range of options. The only limitation is probably the too much fantasy-looking stuff, like outrider knight gauntlets or things like that. But the rest, like gloves or pieces of knight sets, would be pretty much okay. I'll list only some of the options of the hand armor I'd use. Leonhard gloves look quite natural for the age, here as a trophy or something. Sword gauntlet is really great, naturally. I'd say it perfectly fits the image. Another option are sunset gauntlets. And basically I like them in this cosplay as the bloody rags on them fit the image, like something that's used a lot and worn out, and those rags over a knight's gauntlets fits well. Also simple leather gloves would be okay too, I guess. Knight's gauntlets. Again as a trophy thing or something, elite knight's gauntlets. These are only some of the options, but there's no point in listing everything, so let's move on. Chest armor options. Now, the basic chest armor option I use here is no chest armor at all. As really lots of images of Cossacks I found feature shirtless guys. Especially when it comes to real-life reconstructions. Though I suspect that it's somehow related to the fact that events where they do all those performances are held in summer. Anyway, shirtless Cossack in sharovary trousers with sabers is somewhat a cliché, so anyone who sees your character like that would instantly recognize that you're cosplaying exactly a Cossack. Hence no chest armor is not really a bad option. However, historically it, of course, wasn't like that, at least not always, and it wasn't really too common directly in combat. So let's now discuss some more historically correct options, though they'll probably be somewhat less recognizable than shirtless one. And as in case with gauntlets, there are in fact quite some options, from poor ones of rebel peasants, to those of professional warriors. So, the first one was a rather historically common option, simple white shirt, often with a vest over it. And surprisingly enough, there's something similar to it in Dark Souls 3. It's the mirror vest. Well, technically being rather similar. In details the vest is not really that close of course, and it also gives some noble feeling about it. But on the other hand, it's not that terribly different and basically can work for this cosplay, only the question is whether will your character be as recognizable as the shirtless version, since this vest has a specific lore in Dark Souls world. But again, historically it looks close enough, so it's not really a bad option. And let's move on. The next option was common among officers and registered Cossacks. Zupan, often decorated. Zupan was a type of long, lined garment. It was often worn with some sort of cape or coat over it. And in Dark Souls 3 there is Leonhard's garb, which looks rather similar to this type of clothes. However, it naturally gives some noble impression about it. So it can be used to cosplay only some officer characters and alike. Another Dark Souls 3 chest piece that can be used for similar type of attire is the chest part of the old sorcerer's set, I guess. And these two options can be also used for Cossack sorcerer, cleric characters. However, as for cleric type of character, the deacon set is pretty fine too, of course. But returning to the historical warriors, it was naturally not uncommon that elements of actual armor were used over this type of clothes, like cuirasses, spaulders, etc., as it was worn in the battles, after all. So another cosplay option is Black Hand armor / assassin's armor, as it's also a somewhat similar type of clothes along with armor elements over it. In fact, it looks rather well and natural. However, Cossack gear wasn't only about just clothes with some occasional armor elements, especially as for the 16th century. In fact, chain mails, along with some plate armor elements, cuirasses were rather common, especially among the registered Cossacks, as they were used as a melee cavalry, thus required some protection against melee weapons. And it's not a surprise really, as Cossacks inhabited territories between Poland, with its heavily armored shock cavalry, and Ottomans, Crimea Tatars, with their chainmail warriors, so even if it was only about trophies and foreign influence, such armors would still be common. And let's now discuss the actual armor options. The first one is Northern Armor chest piece. In my opinion, it's a rather well and historically correct choice. It's a fairly simple chainmail fitting for an ordinary warrior, really a historically widespread thing. Also the animal hide elements. Belts, single spaulders fit Cossack image quite well, as they carried all sorts of stuff they owned on themselves during the war campaigns. It really looks very natural, not as an element of some armor suit, but a natural part of Cossack set. Another similar option is simple chain set chest piece. And there's a trick with this one, as having sabers as weapons, this cosplay easily turns into the Ottoman warrior cosplay by simply putting the sword set helmet on. But that's a topic for a separate video. Returning to Cossack cosplay, another option, which possibly is not 100% accurate in details but still rather fitting one, is sword set chest piece. And a somewhat similar light armored option is the Herald set chest piece. Use of cuirass without a complete armor set is rather correct, but part of Herald set looks a little too weird as for Cossacks. As for the heavier options, that were also present historically, though less common. Lothric Knight set chest piece looks surprisingly well. It's somewhat similar to armor of polished shock cavalry, without wings of course, or something like that, and such armors could be seen among Cossack cavalry, so it's a nice option really. Other options that probably could more or less work, but I guess they're not really the best options, are Alva set, Drang set, leather armor or brigand set chest pieces. And now, let's finally discuss the weapon choices, though I guess you've already seen some during the previous parts of the video. Let's talk about them in more detail. So, first I'll show the basic loadout I use. Karthus curved sword, Drang hammers, Zui hand for right hand options. Cells or twin blades, target shield, brigand daggers for left hand options. However, these are only some of the historically correct options, and in fact in Dark Souls 3 there were surprisingly many weapons that would be correct to use for Cossack cosplay. So let's discuss them. The main weapon associated with Cossacks are sabers, Cossacks and sabers. it's canon. So this type of weapons is mandatory for a Cossack build. And Dark Souls 3 has enough of such blades. The first option that I'd suggest are the Sword twin blades, as they really look practically the same as some of the sabers used by real-life Cossacks. Option to wield two of them at the same time is really good for this cosplay, as really lots of images and reconstruction videos show Cossacks with two sabers wielding them in rather similar manner. And, basically on the reconstruction shows, among other things, they use somewhat similar strokes to those in Dark Souls 3 when we use the weapon skill or just two-blade attack. However, I doubt that such techniques shown on reconstructions are really historically correct or were used in combat, since it's more like a skill demonstration, like a dance, rather than actual combat. And in those reconstruction duels they even do lots of rolls, like in Dark Souls, so, even if it's not too much historically correct, we can do similar things in Dark Souls and at least it looks cool. But let's proceed to the next weapon option. KazzArma's curved sword. Another good option that is similar to a real-life Cossack saber. And of course we also have the good old scimitar that is also a rather correct choice. In addition to sabers, Cossacks also sometimes used broad daggers as a secondary weapon, so for example, we can also use the brigand twin daggers for this cosplay. Another type of weapons strongly associated with Cossacks are the maces. Though decorated maces were a symbol of Cossack warlords' power, ordinary maces also were used as actual weapons in combat, so maces are in fact a good option for Cossack cosplay. Drang hammers are really fitting. Their fighting animations are also fitting Cossacks well. But spiked or ordinary mace are also historically correct and are a great option. However, as Cossacks were also related to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and later fought against Polish nobility, more European weapons, swords, were also present in Cossack arsenal. Basically they had all sorts of stuff like halberds for example, often as trophies, though, of course were less common, but Western weapons were also present. So the use of late medieval straight greatswords is basically okay for this cosplay. Like Flamberg maybe. Or somewhat legendary Dark Souls weapon, Zweihander. And as for other types of Western weapons, something like red-hilted halberd would be historically fine for this cosplay, though not the most common weapon in the real life. But we'll discuss this class of weapons a little later. For now let's say a few words about shields. As for shields, they weren't too common, but to say that Cossacks didn't use them would be wrong. So, the first option is the target shield. Such shields were indeed used in that period, so it's a great option. Another fine option is Sunset Shield, if you'd like something bigger. Llewellyn Shield is an option too. As for more simple looking things, the KazzArma Shield is also okay. And now let's proceed to the next type of weapons. Spears and pikes were really common among Cossack troops, as infantry used them against enemy cavalry, while Cossack horsemen also used pikes in mounted combat. So the use of spears, pikes for our cosplay would be also historically correct. The first option I'd suggest is partisan spear. However, Lothric Knight long spear is also a great option. Drang twin spears are also an interesting option, however using them both at the same time probably wouldn't be too historically accurate. Historically, Cossacks also used a weapon called Kelep, which is rather similar to Lucerne hammer. So we can use Lucerne of Dark Souls 3 for our cosplay as well, and it would also be correct. Alternatively, we can use the Hazel picks, as they're also somewhat similar to Kelep. And now let's proceed to ranged weapons. though Cossacks are probably most famed for 17th century when they commonly used firearms. Even in that age they kept using bows along with firearms, for example for stealth missions. And the most historically correct choice is the composite bow. Basically it's a perfect choice as it is in fact the same type of bows that was used by the Cossacks. Likely influenced by the Crimean Tatar-mounted archers. Crossbows can be also used, though historically they were less common. And now let's finally proceed to the most interesting part, some more exotic weapons. So, first of all, Cossacks actually used whips in combat. They used it against stunned or lightly armored enemies. But the primary use was against the cavalry. The sounds of whip strikes scared off enemy horses. And as Cossack movement is closely related to the peasant uprisings, and basically many of Cossacks were former peasants, sometimes scythes were actually used for combat in the real life, so if we're after more peasant rebel character, we can use the great scythe and it would be correct historically. Similarly we might also use the four-pronged plough or ordinary hand axe. Cossacks also used some small combat axes, so I guess thrall axes can also be used, but that wouldn't be 100% accurate, as Cossack axes had a little different shape. And returning to more simple weapons, Cossacks actually used clubs, like great clubs. Though smaller clubs would be correct too. Another interesting and historically correct weapon is war pick, as they were also used by Cossacks in the real life. And as for other equipment, I'd suggest using fire bombs, as it would fit the image, though it's not mandatory. Well, I guess that would be it for this video. Again, it's way longer than I thought it would be. Thanks for watching. I really hope that you liked this video. Also check out other lore, etymology or cosplay videos on my channel. Also, check out the fanfic lore attempt to incorporate Cossack characters into the Dark Souls world, story of Chryzemian Wilnex of the Steplands to the east of Karen. And now, the sliders for my Cossack character, though it's just a random face, not a portrait of a specific historical or fictional character.